On the morning of September 16th, 1922, a quiet apple orchard on the outskirts of New Brunswick, New Jersey, became the scene of one of the most disturbing discoveries in American criminal history. A local farmhand walking through the dew-covered grass noticed what at first appeared to be discarded clothing lying beneath an old apple tree. As he drew closer, the terrible reality came into focus. Two bodies lay side by side on the ground, unnaturally arranged as though someone had deliberately positioned them after death. One was a well-dressed Episcopal minister. The other was a married woman known throughout the community as a church choir singer. Blood stained the earth beneath them, and scattered nearby were torn love letters, a pair of eyeglasses, and personal belongings that seemed to tell only fragments of a much larger story. The minister's face was turned toward the woman, while her arm rested unnaturally close to his body. Both had been shot, and both had suffered deep cuts across their throats. Even before investigators fully examined the scene, experienced officers sensed they were standing before something far more complicated than a robbery or a crime of passion. Every object seemed carefully placed. Every clue appeared to raise more questions than answers. News of the discovery spread rapidly through New Brunswick before racing across New Jersey and then the nation. Newspapers interrupted their regular editions with sensational headlines describing the mysterious deaths beneath the apple tree. Within hours, reporters, photographers, curious townspeople, and law enforcement officers crowded the isolated orchard, trampling potential evidence while searching for explanations. It was the kind of crime that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Why would a respected clergyman and a married choir singer meet secretly in a deserted orchard after dark? Why had they both been murdered with such extraordinary violence? Why did their killer appear to remain at the scene long enough to arrange their bodies and scatter personal items around them? Every answer only created another mystery. The victims were quickly identified as Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in New Brunswick, and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, a member of the church choir and the wife of local sexton James Mills. Their names immediately transformed what might have been a local homicide into a national scandal. Edward Hall was not merely another minister. He came from a respected family, served one of the city's prominent churches, and was married into the wealthy Stevens family, one of New Jersey's most influential industrial dynasties. Eleanor Mills was equally familiar to parishioners, admired for her beautiful singing voice, cheerful personality, and tireless work within the congregation. Both appeared to live respectable lives built upon faith, family, and public trust. Yet their deaths hinted at secrets hidden beneath carefully maintained reputations. Detectives arriving at the orchard struggled to preserve what remained of the crime scene. Hundreds of curious visitors had already wandered through the area before. Police established any meaningful perimeter. Footprints crossed one another in every direction. Potential fingerprints disappeared beneath countless hands touching objects for a closer look. Journalists photographed nearly everything before investigators completed their first examination. Such contamination would later haunt the case, making it difficult to separate genuine evidence from accidental interference. Still, certain details stood out immediately. Edward Hall had been shot once in the head at close range. Eleanor Mills had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Both throats had been cut so deeply that investigators believed the killer wanted to ensure death beyond any possibility of survival. Some detectives believed the throat wounds represented personal hatred rather than simple murder. Others wondered whether they had been inflicted to disguise the true cause of death or send a symbolic message. Torn love letters discovered near the bodies hinted at an intimate relationship between the victims. Some pages contained affectionate phrases, while others had been deliberately ripped into pieces too small to reconstruct completely. A pair of broken eyeglasses lay nearby. Business cards bearing Hall's name rested in the grass. Personal effects appeared strangely undisturbed despite the obvious violence. Money remained in pockets. Jewelry had not been stolen. Robbery clearly was not the motive. Instead, investigators increasingly suspected they were confronting a carefully planned execution driven by emotions far stronger than greed. As newspaper editors competed for readers, the story grew even more sensational. Headlines described forbidden love, religious hypocrisy, wealthy families, jealous spouses, revenge, and secret conspiracies. Some articles exaggerated facts before police could verify them. Others invented dramatic details entirely. America in the early 1920s was fascinated by scandal involving respected public figures, and few stories combined sex, religion, wealth, violence, and mystery so completely. Readers, from coast to coast, followed every rumor, every witness interview, and every new theory. The Hall Mills murders quickly eclipsed many other national stories, becoming the defining true crime obsession of the decade. Behind the sensational reporting stood a very real community struggling to understand how such brutality could erupt within its midst. New Brunswick was a growing industrial city located along the Raritan River, home to successful businesses, established churches, immigrant neighborhoods, and influential families whose fortunes shaped local politics and society. Although modern industry had transformed much of the region, Traditional values still carried enormous weight. Churches stood at the center of social life. Respectability mattered deeply. Family reputation could determine business opportunities, political influence, and social acceptance. Public appearances often concealed private struggles, and scandals threatened not only individuals but entire family legacies. Within this environment, the murder of a prominent minister alongside a married choir singer struck at the heart of everything respectable citizens believed about morality and order. Rumor spread almost as quickly as official information. Some claimed organized criminals were responsible. Others whispered that the killings had been ordered by powerful people determined to protect family honor. Some insisted jealous spouses had finally acted upon long-suspected betrayals. Others imagined secret blackmail, hidden fortunes, or political conspiracies. Every conversation in New Brunswick seemed to return to the same haunting questions. Who killed Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills? Why were their bodies arranged so strangely beneath the apple tree? Why did every new clue seem only to deepen the mystery instead of solving it? Investigators promised swift justice, yet almost immediately they found themselves overwhelmed by conflicting testimony, contaminated evidence, public pressure, and relentless newspaper speculation. Long before any suspect entered a courtroom, the Hall Mills murders had already become America's greatest murder mystery. More than a century later, historians still debate nearly every major aspect of the crime. The physical evidence remains incomplete. Witness accounts frequently contradict one another, and many original records have been lost or damaged over time. Yet to understand how two respected members of a church congregation came to die together beneath that lonely apple tree, it is necessary to step back from the horrifying discovery and examine the lives they lived before that September morning. Behind the headlines stood real people shaped by ambition, faith, marriage, social expectations, and hidden desires. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall appeared to embody everything expected of an Episcopal minister, while Eleanor Reinhardt Mills seemed to represent devotion to both family and church. Their public images inspired trust, but appearances rarely revealed the full truth. As investigators gradually uncovered letters, conversations, and whispered memories, a startling reality began to emerge. Edward and Eleanor were secretly in love. The secret that eventually shocked New Brunswick had not begun with reckless passion or dramatic declarations. Instead, it developed quietly within the familiar walls of St. John's Episcopal Church, where Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills spent countless hours together carrying out the ordinary duties of parish life. Hall, as rector, led worship services, supervised church activities, visited parishioners, and organized charitable work. Eleanor, blessed with a warm soprano voice and a cheerful personality, devoted herself to the church choir, rehearsals, fundraisers, and community gatherings. Their responsibilities frequently placed them side by side. At first, no one thought much of their conversations. Ministers were expected to encourage members of their congregation, and choir singers often worked closely with clergy. Their growing friendship seemed entirely natural. Yet over time, small moments began to attract attention. They lingered after rehearsals while others gathered their coats. They exchanged smiles that seemed warmer than simple politeness. Edward found reasons to compliment Eleanor's singing, while Eleanor appeared unusually eager to assist with church projects that required extended meetings with the rector. None of these moments alone suggested scandal, but together they slowly formed a pattern that observant parishioners could not entirely ignore. Both Edward and Eleanor lived in marriages that, at least publicly, fulfilled the expectations of respectable society. Edward's wife, Frances Stevens Hall, belonged to one of New Jersey's wealthiest and most influential families. Her relatives possessed considerable financial resources, social prestige, and political connections. Their marriage elevated Hall's own standing, but many who knew the couple privately described their relationship as emotionally distant. Edward devoted much of his energy to the church, while Frances focused on maintaining the dignity and status expected of someone bearing the Stevens name. They rarely displayed affection in public, and although no one openly accused them of unhappiness, acquaintances sometimes remarked upon the cool formality that characterized their relationship. Eleanor's marriage to James Mills presented a different picture. James served as the sexton of St. John's Episcopal Church, performing practical duties that kept the parish functioning. He cared for the church building, rang the bells, prepared the sanctuary for services, and handled countless responsibilities that often went unnoticed by the congregation. The Mills family lived modestly, raising their children while balancing financial pressures familiar to many working-class households. Eleanor contributed by taking in sewing work and dedicating herself to church activities. To neighbors, they appeared to be an ordinary family navigating the challenges of daily life. Yet ordinary appearances often conceal complicated emotions, and historians continue to debate how much James suspected about his wife's growing attachment to the minister. As Edward and Eleanor spent more time together, their friendship crossed an invisible line into emotional intimacy. They discovered shared interests in literature, poetry, and religious devotion. Edward frequently quoted scripture, while Eleanor responded with verses from hymns and favorite poems. Their conversations expanded beyond church business into discussions of loneliness, hope, disappointment, and dreams that neither felt comfortable expressing elsewhere. The relationship offered each something missing from everyday life. Edward found someone who admired him, not because of his title or family connections, but because she genuinely valued his words and attention. Eleanor found someone who listened carefully, encouraged her talents, and treated her as more than a wife burdened by routine responsibilities. Eventually, spoken conversations no longer seemed sufficient. They began exchanging handwritten letters, carefully folded and secretly delivered whenever opportunities arose. Many of those letters disappeared forever, but fragments recovered after the murders revealed remarkable intimacy. Edward addressed Eleanor with affectionate language that blurred the boundaries between spiritual guidance and romantic devotion. Eleanor responded with equal warmth, expressing deep emotional attachment and longing for moments they could spend together away from curious eyes. Some letters discussed faith and eternal love, while others contained unmistakably romantic sentiments. Historians have debated whether their relationship became physically intimate, but the surviving correspondence leaves little doubt that they considered themselves deeply in love. Because both were married, absolute secrecy became essential. Meetings that once occurred openly at church gradually shifted to quieter locations. Sometimes they remained inside the sanctuary after choir practice until everyone else departed. At other times, they arranged brief encounters during walks through less crowded streets or secluded country roads outside New Brunswick. According to later testimony, Edward occasionally drove his automobile to isolated areas where they could speak without interruption. Such meetings carried enormous risks. In a community where nearly everyone knew one another, a single unexpected witness could destroy reputations built over decades. Every glance over shoulder, every delayed return home, every unexplained absence increased the danger. Their love existed beneath constant fear of exposure. Rumors, nevertheless, began circulating within the congregation. Some choir members noticed Eleanor receiving unusual attention from the rector. Others remarked that Edward seemed unusually protective whenever anyone criticized her. Anonymous gossip spread quietly through social gatherings, sewing circles, and neighborhood conversations. No one possessed concrete proof, but suspicion often requires very little evidence to flourish. Certain parishioners dismissed the whispers as malicious jealousy directed toward a popular minister. Others privately wondered whether appearances had indeed become misleading. Church communities of the early 20th century prized moral leadership, and even the suggestion of an improper relationship involving a clergyman threatened the credibility of the entire parish. Edward undoubtedly understood these dangers. As a minister, he preached fidelity, honesty, and Christian virtue from the pulpit every Sunday. Discovery of an affair would not merely embarrass him personally, it could destroy his ministry, disgrace the Stevens family, and permanently stain the reputation of St. John's Episcopal Church. Eleanor faced equally devastating consequences. Divorce remained socially unacceptable for many families, particularly within religious communities. Exposure could cost her marriage, separate her from her children, and reduce her standing within a society that judged women especially harshly for perceived moral failures. Every letter they exchanged, therefore, represented extraordinary risk. Every secret meeting challenged the carefully ordered lives they outwardly maintained. The affair also unfolded during a period when newspapers eagerly exploited stories involving scandal among prominent citizens. Across America, readers consumed sensational accounts of corruption, infidelity, and crime with growing enthusiasm. Edward and Eleanor likely understood that if their relationship became public, they would not simply face local embarrassment. They could become the subject of widespread public humiliation extending far beyond New Brunswick. Nevertheless, neither ended the relationship. Instead, surviving evidence suggests their emotional commitment only deepened as months passed. Their correspondence became more affectionate, their meetings more frequent. Their confidence that love justified secrecy appeared to outweigh fears of eventual discovery. Whether this confidence reflected genuine optimism or dangerous self-deception remains impossible to determine. Meanwhile, subtle changes in behavior continued attracting attention. Neighbors occasionally observed Eleanor leaving home at unusual hours. Members of the congregation noticed Edward appearing distracted during church functions. Small inconsistencies accumulated, each insignificant alone, but increasingly suspicious when viewed together. Some later witnesses claimed they had seen the pair walking together outside town. Others insisted they overheard conversations hinting at unusual closeness. Many of these accounts emerged only after the murders, making their accuracy difficult to evaluate. Yet they demonstrate how quickly ordinary memories became reinterpreted once the affair entered public knowledge. Historians caution that some testimony was undoubtedly influenced by hindsight, newspaper publicity, and the desire to participate in America's most sensational criminal investigation. Even so, there's little question that whispers had begun circulating before the killings occurred. Whether those whispers reached the ears of jealous spouses, influential family members, or someone capable of violence remains one of the central mysteries surrounding the case. By early September 1922, Edward and Eleanor continued exchanging letters despite mounting risks. Their secret world depended upon silence from everyone around them. Every unnoticed meeting reinforced the illusion that they could continue balancing forbidden love against respectable public lives indefinitely. Yet secrets rarely remain, hidden forever. Somewhere within New Brunswick, another pair of eyes may have followed them. Another set of ears may have overheard conversations never intended for outsiders. Another heart may have filled with anger, betrayal, or determination. As summer faded toward autumn, the dangers surrounding their relationship seemed to grow with every passing day. Neither Edward nor Eleanor could know that only a short time remained before their final meeting beneath the apple tree. Looking back across more than a century, one haunting possibility continues to overshadow every surviving letter and every whispered rumor. Someone may have discovered the affair. September 14th, 1922, began like countless other late summer days in New Brunswick. The air was warm, the streets bustled with workers, merchants, and students, and nothing outwardly suggested that before another sunrise, two respected members of St. John's Episcopal Church would be dead beneath an apple tree. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall followed his usual routine, attending to church responsibilities, speaking with parishioners, and returning home to the rectory he shared with his wife, Frances Stevens Hall. To anyone observing him that afternoon, he appeared calm and composed. There were no public arguments, no dramatic confrontations, and no visible signs that he expected danger. Eleanor Reinhardt Mills likewise spent much of the day occupied with ordinary domestic responsibilities. She cared for her household, spoke with neighbors, and remained attentive to her family. Her husband, James Mills, continued his work connected to the church, apparently unaware that the evening would become one of the most scrutinized nights in American criminal history. If either Edward or Eleanor sensed that someone had been watching them, neither left behind any record revealing such fears. Yet later, investigators would wonder whether subtle warnings had already appeared in the days leading up to their final meeting. During the late afternoon, Edward reportedly made preparations that suggested he intended to leave home after dinner. Such evening outings were not necessarily unusual for a minister. Parish visits, church business, and pastoral responsibilities frequently required travel outside regular working hours. Frances Hall later described portions of the evening according to her recollection, although her statements would receive intense scrutiny during subsequent investigations. As with many witnesses in the Hall-Mills case, memories shifted over time, and even small discrepancies became subjects of heated debate. Historians caution that reconstructing the exact movements of everyone involved has proven extraordinarily difficult because testimony often conflicted and contemporary records were incomplete. Nevertheless, investigators eventually assembled a probable timeline from surviving evidence, witness interviews, and physical clues. As darkness settled over New Brunswick, Eleanor also prepared to leave home. According to testimony presented during the investigation, she informed members of her household that she intended to attend choir-related matters or church business. Such explanations would not have seemed unusual. Her regular involvement with St. John's meant evening rehearsals and meetings were familiar parts of her routine. Yet this particular outing differed from ordinary church obligations. Hidden among her personal belongings were letters exchanged with Edward Hall, tangible reminders of the secret relationship they had nurtured for months. Whether she carried those letters intentionally or simply happened to have them remains uncertain, but their presence at the crime scene would later become one of the investigation's most intriguing details. Sometime after nightfall, Edward Hall left the rectory. Eleanor departed her own home separately. They traveled independently, careful not to attract unnecessary attention by leaving together. Their destination was an isolated area known as Drusay's Lane, a rural stretch outside the center of New Brunswick bordered by farmland and orchards. The location offered privacy, far removed from curious neighbors and familiar parishioners. Couples seeking quiet conversations occasionally visited such secluded roads, particularly during pleasant autumn evenings. Whether Edward selected the meeting place because he believed it safe or because it had served them well during previous encounters remains unknown. What is clear is that both arrived there expecting conversation rather than violence. The apple orchard stood silent beneath the night sky. Rows of trees cast long shadows across uneven ground, while only faint moonlight filtered through branches heavy with fruit. The rural landscape created an atmosphere of peaceful isolation. There, away from church walls and social expectations, Edward and Eleanor could briefly imagine a world where their affection carried no consequences. Historians can only speculate about the conversation that unfolded beneath the trees. Perhaps they discussed their future. Perhaps they spoke of ending the affair. Perhaps they worried about rumors spreading through the congregation. Perhaps they simply treasured another stolen hour together. No surviving witness heard their words, and the torn letters discovered later provide only incomplete glimpses into their emotional lives. What happened next remains one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. Several witnesses later claimed to have seen unusual activity in the vicinity that evening, although their accounts frequently contradicted one another. Some reported observing an automobile traveling along the country road at an unusually late hour. Others described figures standing near the orchard. Still others remembered hearing voices carried faintly across the fields. None of these observations appeared especially significant at the time. Only after news of the murder spread did people begin attaching importance to ordinary memories. Investigators struggled to determine which recollections reflected genuine observations and which had become unintentionally altered by publicity, rumor, and repeated questioning. One recurring element involved strange sounds reported during the night. Residents living some distance from DeRussey's Lane later stated that they had heard noises resembling gunshots. Others recalled dogs barking persistently or hearing raised voices carried by the wind. A few insisted they heard an automobile speeding away shortly afterward. Yet these accounts varied considerably regarding both time and sequence. Rural nighttime environments naturally produced unfamiliar sounds, making precise identification difficult. Furthermore, once newspapers described gunfire and murder, many witnesses understandably reconsidered noises they might otherwise have dismissed. Despite these uncertainties, investigators generally concluded that the fatal attack occurred sometime late on September 14th, or during the early hours of September 15th. The killer, or killers, almost certainly approached while Edward and Eleanor were together beneath the apple tree. Whether the victims recognized their attacker remains impossible to establish. Some historians believe they must have known the person, reasoning that neither appeared to have fled before the shooting began. Others argue that surprise alone could explain the lack of defensive evidence. According to forensic examinations available at the time, Edward Hall sustained a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Eleanor Mills suffered multiple gunshot wounds before both victims experienced deep incisions across their throats. The sequence of these injuries has remained a matter of debate because forensic science in 1922 lacked many modern investigative techniques. Some experts believe the shootings occurred first, followed by the throat wounds. Others propose different sequences based upon blood patterns and body positions. Regardless of exact order, the violence demonstrated extraordinary determination. Whoever committed the murders intended to leave no possibility of survival. Another disturbing feature involved the apparent arrangement of the bodies after death. Edward and Eleanor were found lying close together beneath the apple tree in positions that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental collapse. Personal belongings, including eyeglasses, calling cards, and fragments of love letters, were scattered nearby. Whether the killer intentionally displayed these items as symbolic messages or whether they simply fell during the struggle has never been conclusively established. The torn letters especially fascinated investigators because they simultaneously revealed the affair while withholding complete understanding of its emotional significance. They served as both evidence and enigma. Somewhere during those final moments, silence returned to the orchard. The confrontation ended. The attacker vanished into the darkness, leaving behind two lifeless bodies and a crime scene unlike anything New Brunswick had previously encountered. No immediate alarm reached nearby homes. No confirmed eyewitness stepped forward, claiming to have seen the murders themselves. The orchard remained undisturbed for hours, its terrible secret hidden beneath the branches of the old apple tree while the surrounding countryside slept. Families throughout New Brunswick retired for the night, unaware that one of America's most infamous unsolved murder cases had already unfolded beyond the edge of town. Dawn gradually approached, bringing pale light across the fields and revealing nothing unusual to travelers passing at a distance. Birds resumed their morning songs, farming. Workers prepared for another ordinary day, and the quiet orchard waited for the first person whose path would cross beneath its trees. Within a few hours, the shocking discovery would ignite headlines across the nation, draw hundreds of investigators and reporters to the scene, and begin a century-long search for answers that has never truly ended. But in those final moments before sunrise, only the motionless figures beneath the apple tree bore witness to the violence that had shattered two lives and created a mystery destined to outlive everyone involved. The discovery of Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills beneath the apple tree transformed an isolated orchard into one of the most intensely examined crime scenes in American history. Yet from the very beginning, the investigation was hindered by mistakes that modern detectives would consider catastrophic. Before authorities established effective control over the area, hundreds of curious spectators, reporters, photographers, and local residents wandered freely through the orchard. Some stood only inches from the bodies. Others picked up objects, examined them, and placed them back on the ground. Footprints overlapped in every direction, making it nearly impossible to distinguish those belonging to the killer from those left by onlookers. Potential fingerprints disappeared beneath countless hands. Even automobiles carrying visitors crossed sections of nearby ground that might otherwise have preserved valuable tire tracks. By the time investigators attempted a systematic examination, much of the original physical evidence had already been compromised beyond recovery. Despite these obstacles, certain features of the crime scene immediately convinced detectives that they were dealing with an unusually personal and carefully executed murder. Edward Hall's body lay on its back, with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Eleanor Mills rested nearby, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Medical examiners also observed that both victims had deep cuts across their throats. The combination of gunfire and slashing injuries appeared excessive if the killer's only objective had been to ensure death. Several investigators concluded that the throat wounds reflected overwhelming rage, humiliation, or a symbolic desire to silence the victims forever. Others argued that the cuts may have been inflicted afterward to confuse investigators regarding the exact sequence of events. Because forensic pathology remained relatively undeveloped in 1922, experts could not answer these questions with certainty, leaving later historians to debate interpretations based upon incomplete records. Equally intriguing were the objects scattered around the bodies. Torn fragments of love letters lay among the grass, many stained with dirt and blood. Although some passages remain legible, other sections had been deliberately ripped away, preventing investigators from reconstructing the complete correspondence. Whether the killer intentionally destroyed portions of the letters, or whether they tore during a struggle, remains unknown. A pair of broken eyeglasses rested nearby, prompting speculation that one of the victims had dropped them during a confrontation. Business cards bearing Edward Hall's name were also discovered close to the bodies, along with personal belongings that had not been stolen. Money remained untouched. Jewelry had not been removed. Valuable possessions still accompanied both victims. These details effectively eliminated robbery as the primary motive and directed attention toward relationships, jealousy, revenge, or family honor. Investigators also noticed the curious positioning of the bodies. Edward and Eleanor appeared to have been placed close together beneath the apple tree after the violence ended. Some detectives believed the arrangement symbolized the affair that had linked them in life. Others argued that the victims simply collapsed near one another during the attack. The available evidence never resolved the question conclusively, but nearly everyone agreed that the overall scene differed dramatically from ordinary homicides. It appeared almost theatrical, as though someone wished the discovery itself to communicate a message. Unfortunately, because so many spectators entered the orchard before careful documentation occurred, investigators could never determine with confidence which details reflected the killer's actions and which resulted from later disturbance. The missing evidence proved just as frustrating as the evidence that remained. No murder weapon was recovered. No reliable fingerprints linked any suspect to the scene. Bloodstain analysis, DNA testing, ballistic comparison, and modern trace evidence techniques did not yet exist. Detectives relied heavily upon witness testimony, personal relationships, and circumstantial evidence, all of which proved vulnerable to contradiction and manipulation. As newspaper coverage intensified, public pressure mounted for swift arrests. Officials therefore turned increasingly toward identifying possible suspects whose motives could explain the extraordinary violence. The first, and perhaps most publicly discussed suspect was Frances Stevens Hall, Edward's wife. From the moment the affair became widely known, many observers assumed she possessed a clear motive. Discovery of her husband's relationship with Eleanor could have brought profound humiliation not only upon her personally, but also upon the powerful Stevens family. Some witnesses later claimed Frances had suspected the affair for months, while others insisted she remained unaware until after the murders. Prosecutors eventually argued that jealousy and family honor provided sufficient reasons to consider her involvement. Yet significant weaknesses complicated this theory. No direct physical evidence placed Frances at the orchard on the night of the killings. Much of the testimony against her emerged years later from witnesses whose credibility became fiercely contested during trial. Historians continue to disagree about how reliable those accounts truly were. Closely connected to this theory were Henry Stevens, Frances's brother, and Willie Stevens, her cousin. Both belonged to the influential Stevens family, whose wealth and social standing attracted enormous public attention throughout the investigation. Supporters of this hypothesis suggested that male relatives might have acted to defend family honor if they believed Edward's affair threatened the family's reputation. Rumor circulated that the Stevens men possessed both the resources and determination to arrange or personally commit the murders. Prosecutors explored these possibilities extensively, particularly during the sensational trial that followed. Nevertheless, once again, direct evidence remained frustratingly limited. Witness statements frequently conflicted regarding the movements of Henry and Willie on the night of September 14th. Defense attorneys emphasized the absence of reliable forensic proof, while prosecutors relied heavily upon circumstantial interpretations and disputed eyewitness testimony. Another theory proposed that a professional killer had carried out the murders on behalf of someone wishing to remain hidden. advocates of this explanation pointed to the apparent efficiency of the attack and the possibility that the bodies had been deliberately arranged afterward. If hired assassins were involved, the person ordering the crime might never have approached the orchard personally. However, investigators uncovered no convincing financial records, communications, or documented agreements supporting the existence of such a murder-for-hire plot. While intriguing, the theory remained speculative rather than evidence-based. Attention also naturally focused upon James Mills, Eleanor's husband. History contains numerous examples of jealous spouses committing acts of violence after discovering infidelity, making him an obvious person of interest. Detectives questioned him extensively regarding his knowledge of the affair and his whereabouts during the critical hours. Yet, despite understandable suspicion, investigators failed to produce persuasive evidence linking James directly to the crime scene. No witness reliably placed him at de Rousset's lane during the murders, and no physical evidence connected him to the killings. Although emotional motive alone could not be dismissed, it proved insufficient to sustain criminal charges. Finally, some investigators considered the possibility that the murderer had been someone entirely outside the immediate circle of family and spouses. An unidentified attacker may have learned of the secret meetings through gossip, accidental observation, or anonymous information. Such an individual could have acted from obsession, religious outrage, personal grievance, or motives that disappeared forever with the passage of time. This theory explained certain uncertainties within the evidence, but suffered from one obvious weakness: no credible suspect fitting. This description was ever identified. As weeks turned into months, the Hall Mills investigation expanded into what newspapers proudly labeled America's greatest murder case. Reporters from across the country descended upon New Brunswick, transforming courthouse proceedings into national spectacles. Every rumor became front-page news. Every witness interview generated sensational headlines. Crowds gathered outside courtrooms hours before hearings began, hoping to glimpse the accused, prominent attorneys, or celebrated journalists covering the proceedings. Vendors sold newspapers describing each day's dramatic testimony almost as quickly as printers could produce them. The case became one of the earliest examples of modern media turning a criminal investigation into continuous public entertainment. When the long-awaited trial finally commenced, prosecutors sought to convince jurors that the Stevens family had orchestrated the murders to preserve wealth, status, and honor. Defense attorneys attacked the credibility of prosecution witnesses with relentless cross-examinations, exposing contradictions, changing stories, and possible motives for fabrication. Some witnesses admitted they had altered portions of their accounts over time. Others struggled to remember precise details years after the events. Newspaper publicity had saturated nearly every aspect of the case, raising difficult questions about whether memories had become influenced by repeated reporting and community gossip. Jurors faced an extraordinarily difficult task. They heard weeks of testimony describing secret love affairs, powerful families, disputed timelines, inconsistent witness statements, and missing evidence. Yet they never received the kind of decisive forensic proof that modern criminal trials often depend upon. Suspicion alone could not satisfy the legal requirement of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Ultimately, after weighing conflicting testimony and recognizing the profound weaknesses in the prosecution's case, the jury returned verdicts of not guilty for the defendants. The courtroom erupted with emotional reactions. But one undeniable fact remained. Although the trial had ended, the central mystery had not. No court identified the killer, no confession emerged, and the question that had haunted investigators since the bodies were discovered beneath the apple tree remained unanswered. The Hall Mills murders would leave the courtroom exactly as they had entered it, officially unsolved. Although the jury's verdict brought the sensational Hall Mills trial to a legal conclusion, it did not bring peace to the families involved, nor did it satisfy a public that had spent years following every twist of the investigation. Across the United States, newspaper editors devoted entire pages to the outcome, with some declaring that justice had failed, while others argued that the prosecution had never presented sufficient evidence to justify convictions. Editorial writers debated whether wealth and social influence had protected the accused, or whether investigators had simply built a case upon rumors, unreliable witnesses, and speculation instead of provable facts. The Hall Mills murders became far more than a local tragedy. They evolved into a symbol of the limitations of early 20th century criminal investigations, and a reminder that public opinion does not always align with legal proof. For the families left behind, however, the headlines eventually faded, while the consequences remained permanent. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills were buried, but the scandal attached to their names endured for generations. Frances Stevens Hall continued to live under the shadow of suspicion despite her acquittal. James Mills was forced to rebuild a life marked by the public exposure of his wife's affair and her violent death. Members of the Stevens family faced years of whispered accusations, despite the absence of convictions. In New Brunswick, residents rarely spoke openly about the case without disagreement. Some believed the jury had reached the correct decision because the evidence simply was not strong enough. Others remained convinced that the truth had been concealed by powerful interests. Time softened emotions, but never erased uncertainty. Historians studying the case over the following decades encountered enormous obstacles. Important evidence had disappeared. Some original investigative files had been misplaced or damaged. Physical exhibits once preserved for trial were no longer available for modern scientific examination. Witnesses who might have clarified confusing testimony passed away long before forensic technology advanced sufficiently to reanalyze the crime. Unlike contemporary investigations, which routinely preserve DNA samples, digital records, surveillance footage, and detailed forensic documentation, the Hall-Mills case depended heavily upon fragile paper records, fading memories, and evidence that had already been compromised within hours of the murders. Every passing decade made certainty more difficult rather than less. Nevertheless, the mystery continued attracting researchers, journalists, and true crime authors determined to discover overlooked clues. Some revisited original newspaper accounts, comparing them against courtroom transcripts and police reports. Others examined family correspondence, property records, and personal diaries in hopes of identifying inconsistencies that earlier investigators had missed. While these efforts occasionally corrected historical misunderstandings or clarified timelines, none produced conclusive proof identifying the killer. Instead, each new examination tended to reinforce a frustrating conclusion. There remained enough evidence to support multiple theories, but not enough to confirm any single explanation beyond reasonable doubt. Modern forensic experts have also offered opinions regarding aspects of the investigation. Looking back through surviving photographs and medical descriptions, some specialists argue that today's crime scene preservation techniques would likely have recovered fingerprints, biological evidence, trace fibers, footwear impressions, or ballistic information capable of identifying the attacker. DNA analysis alone might have transformed the investigation if suitable evidence had been preserved. Bloodstain pattern analysis could perhaps have clarified the sequence of injuries. Advanced pathology might have established a more precise timeline of death. Digital mapping and crime scene reconstruction could have revealed whether the bodies had truly been repositioned after death, or whether appearances resulted naturally from the victim's collapse. Yet such possibilities remain purely hypothetical, because the physical evidence necessary for those techniques has largely disappeared. The investigation therefore occupies a unique place in criminal history, a famous mystery whose solution may have been permanently lost, not because clues never existed, but because the investigative methods of the era could not preserve them. Theories continue to compete more than a century later. Some historians believe the murders resulted from an intensely personal act, driven by jealousy after the affair became known. Others suspect the involvement of multiple individuals acting together rather than a lone killer. A few researchers continue exploring the possibility that influential family members sought to protect their reputation, while others reject that interpretation as unsupported by reliable evidence. There are scholars who argue that investigators focused too narrowly upon the affair itself, potentially overlooking unrelated motives that disappeared beneath sensational newspaper coverage. Because the available evidence remains incomplete, responsible historians generally avoid declaring any individual guilty. Instead, they emphasize the distinction between suspicion and proof, recognizing that the legal record ultimately failed to establish criminal responsibility for any specific person. Another reason the Hall-Mills murders continue to fascinate historians lies in the remarkable intersection of themes contained within a single case. It combined forbidden romance, religious leadership, family prestige, social class, media sensationalism, forensic limitations, courtroom drama, and enduring mystery. The story unfolded during the Roaring Twenties, a period when American society was experiencing rapid cultural change while still holding tightly to traditional expectations concerning marriage, morality, and reputation. Edward Hall's position as an Episcopal minister intensified public fascination because his private actions appeared to conflict with his public role. Eleanor Mills represented another tragic dimension, a woman whose search for affection ultimately became inseparable from one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. Together, they became symbols of the complicated relationship between public respectability and private desire. The media coverage surrounding the case also left a lasting legacy. Newspapers competed fiercely for exclusive interviews, dramatic illustrations, and sensational headlines. Reporters often published rumors before investigators could verify them, while anonymous sources fueled endless speculation. The Hall-Mills investigation demonstrated both the power and the danger of intense press attention. Public interest ensured that the murders would never be forgotten, But constant publicity also complicated witness testimony, influenced community perceptions, and blurred the boundary between verified fact and popular legend. Many historians view the case as an early example of the true crime phenomenon that continues to captivate audiences today. Even after more than 100 years, visitors occasionally travel to New Brunswick seeking locations connected with the murders. The original orchard has long since changed, and much of the surrounding landscape bears little resemblance to that quiet rural setting of September 1922. Yet the story survives in books, documentaries, academic studies, podcasts, and historical discussions. Every generation seems to rediscover the mystery and ask the same questions. Investigators first confronted beneath the apple tree. Who fired the fatal shots? Why were both victims' throats cut after the gunfire? Were the bodies deliberately arranged? Who tore the love letters? Did the killer intend to send a message, conceal evidence, or simply satisfy personal vengeance? Most importantly, why did no one ever face legal responsibility for one of the nation's most infamous double murders? The answers remain elusive. The Hall Mills case reminds us that history does not always provide neat conclusions. Courts require proof, historians seek evidence, and investigators pursue facts. Yet sometimes the surviving record refuses to yield certainty. Witnesses forget, documents disappear, physical evidence deteriorates, rumors multiply while reliable information diminishes. In such circumstances, mysteries endure not because people stop searching, but because the decisive clue may already have been lost forever. More than a century after Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills met beneath that lonely apple tree, their deaths continue to occupy a unique place in American criminal history. Their story serves as both a compelling true crime narrative and a cautionary lesson about the importance of preserving evidence, resisting premature conclusions, and distinguishing between suspicion and demonstrated fact. Every new generation of researchers inherits the same unanswered questions left behind in the orchard on that September morning. Some believe the truth still waits within overlooked archives. Others suspect it vanished with the final witnesses who carried their secrets to the grave. Whatever the reality may be, the Hall Mills murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved cases ever recorded, a mystery suspended between documented history and enduring speculation.